Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Ayşe Süberker. It's a war with no end in sight. For 8 years, Syrians have been suffering under the brutal onslaught of the Assad regime. And with hundreds of thousands dead and millions displaced, the world is searching for a way out. At the latest Syria summit in Ankara, the leaders of Turkey, Russia and Iran agreed that a political solution was the only way to stop the bloodshed. And a key component to that will be forming a constitutional committee whose details were agreed upon by the three leaders. Made up of pro-government, opposition and independent members, the committee will be tasked with writing Syria's new constitution. But previous calls for a political solution have been met with more bombings and renewed offensives by the regime. No place has seen this more than Idlib, which continues to be plagued by violence despite a ceasefire being agreed to in late August. So, will the creation of a constitutional committee actually change the situation on the ground? Will they be able to write a constitution that can bring together warring sides that have been fighting for 8 years? And to answer that, joining me now is Andrei Krikovic, who is an associate professor at HSE University in Moscow, and Talip Küçükcan, who is a former Turkish MP and a senior fellow at TRT World Research Center. Gentlemen, welcome to Straight Talk. Andrei, thanks for flying in. So the leaders of Turkey, Russia and Iran met for the 5th Trilateral Summit on Syria. And decisions made on the situation in Idlib and the formation of the Constitutional Committee signal a new phase for Syria's future. Andrei, I want to start with you. How significant was this summit when compared to the previous ones?
Well, I mean, it's a good thing that they're keeping the talk, but not much was really accomplished, I would say. Kicking the can down the road seems to be kind of what they're doing, but keeping communication open is important. But we can see that not really much of a resolution was agreed to here, that the statements following the summit really kind of reiterated what the positions have been before.
But this is the first time the leaders actually announced the formation of this constitutional committee. Isn't it significant?
In itself, yes, but we still have to see how this kind of plays itself out. I mean, I'm not trying to denigrate the entire process, but I'm also not too optimistic, to be honest with you.
Okay, so Talib, what do you make of this? Do you believe this formation of this constitutional committee will change something on the ground after 8 years of fighting?
I think that's an important step. I a little bit disagree with Andrej, because all leaders talked about political solutions, urgency of political solutions. Before that, we have looked at mostly security issues, okay, and migration, refugees, etc., etc., and defense issues. But now, for the first time, three leaders agreed that some kind of political process should be launched. I think at the basis of this, the Constitutional Commission is important because the names, etc., mandate were agreed upon. I think if this is given an international support in the Geneva or in other formats, I think that is an important step. It's not only that. I think three leaders have also said that territorial integrity of Syria is extremely important. I think this is a very strong statement.
But they've been repeating that.
Yes, but the non-state actors in the Syrian context, they are getting more and more power, and the Damascus is becoming less and less influential. So that is a threat for the region, that smaller states might appear, failed states might emerge in the region. That is an existential threat for the regional powers, especially for Turkey, Iraq, Lebanon, and Jordan.
So this committee will be comprised of pro-regime members, opposition, and the NGO. So what does this tell about us? I mean, that Assad's removal from power is not a prerequisite anymore?
It hasn't been for Russia, actually. So, I mean, it hasn't been something that Russia has been pushing. That Assad can go, he can stay. What's important is that there's some kind of process that involves the Syrian people that's legitimate and it adheres to international law. So the misconception with Russia is that they're somehow wedded to Assad, but they really aren't. What's important for Russia is that they have a legitimate resolution to the Syrian crisis.
So, Talib, from Turkey's perspective and Western powers' perspective, will this legitimize the regime?
I think Turkey has argued for many years since the start that the future of Syria will be decided by the people of Syria, not by foreign powers. The foreign powers or foreign, let's say, actors should facilitate this kind of resolution. But we have to be realistic as well. We are talking about a regime which has caused a havoc in the country, and millions of people were displaced, and thousands of people were killed. And how realistic it will be that a regime that many people hold responsible for this kind of results might remain. So for the Turkish, I think, political elite, Assad has lost its legitimacy in its own country. However, of course, I think if there is a consensus, which is quite difficult, whether Assad will remain in power or not, I think it will be, again, the decision of the Syrian people.
We'll see that in the future.
It is very, I think, early to say something about it. But from the beginning, I think the Turkish side thinks that Assad lost his legitimacy as a political leader in the country.
On the other hand, all leaders agreed that an action should be taken on Idlib as soon as possible, but they didn't tell what it is. So, Andre, what's at stake in the region?
Well, I mean, that's precisely at stake, is that the security situation is up in the air. It's getting worse. There are so many factors, and from the Israeli elections, how they'll play themselves out, to what's going on with Iran and the United States. Is Iran now taking a tougher line? How will they, influence Assad? So with my colleague, I agree that, this constitutional committee being, going forward is a very big step. But without the security fundamentals there, and with the security situation, we didn't really hear much about how this situation will, solve itself. There's only so much pushing you can go. Aleppo created Idlib, and now what's after Idlib? I mean, is this going to spill over into Turkey? And then what's next after that? So
will this ceasefire hold this time?
Well, it's a $1 million question, right? It's a very tough question. It's one that has so many moving parts. So for Russia, it's very important that they don't want to see a bloodbath. They don't necessarily want to see Assad win, but they can't have these, from their point of view, Salafist, jihadist extremists, using this as a safe zone to launch attacks. So can Turkey do what, from the Russian perspective, is their job of weeding those out, those elements, and getting rid of those elements? Can Russia restrain Assad? That's what their job is.
Yeah, in the meantime, can Russia restrain Assad?
Well, I mean, it's not just Russia.
Because maybe Assad is thinking he's winning.
He's thinking he's winning, and also, he's backing, Russia in the air and Iran on the ground. And what's the Iran end game now? I mean, we don't know what happened with Saudi Arabia, the attack on the oil infrastructure. Maybe this is, maybe it's the Houthis, but maybe it's also, this, backed by the Iranians to, force some kind of resolution to their own problems with the sanctions and with the United States. So if you have a much more aggressive stance by Iran, this also could play itself.
So Talib, what do you think will happen in Idlib?
I think in the situation in Idlib is about to blow up, and this is a cause of concern mostly for Turkey, because people who would run away from the Idlib crisis will end up near Turkey's border. That's why Turkey, I think, has emphasized this in the summit meeting, that there must be some kind of solution in Idlib. Otherwise, the consequences will not only influence Turkey. So, and President Erdogan has said that if there is a flow of people, hundreds and thousands of people, Turkey will not be able to shoulder this responsibility on its own this time. So
Turkey's concerns have not been met at this summit?
I think the leaders acknowledged that Turkey has the right to defend itself if there's something coming from there.
But there's also the risk of millions of people flocking to Turkey's border.
I think that is still, there is a limbo in there. I think there hasn't been any very concrete steps taken, because we are talking about not only Turkey, Russia, but also Iran, and also maybe some other actors. Therefore, there is a very complicated situation in Idlib, and if that continues in the same direction, I think there will be a lot of troubles in that region.
All right, we talked about the situation in Idlib and how will this new committee work under the current circumstances. Now let's move to the northeastern parts of Syria, where Turkey wants to set up a safe zone for the return of Syrian refugees. On the other hand, all we know that Turkey and the United States are still trying to iron out their differences over Syria. And while they've agreed to a safe zone, the central issue remains that the U.S. supports the YPG terror group despite Turkish opposition. Abu Bakr al-Shamahi has this report from Akçakale on the Turkey-Syria border.
Turkish and US forces have been conducting joint military patrols in northern Syria for 2 weeks now. It's a sign of cooperation. But the reality is that the two allies are not on the same page. Turkey has been threatening to unilaterally start a military operation in Syria east of the Euphrates River since last year. The Turkish argument is that it needs to protect its border. It's calling for a safe zone to be established on the Syrian side, and for the YPG terror group to be cleared from the area. The issue is that while Turkey considers the YPG a terrorist organization, the United States backs the group and arms it. And after meeting the Iranian and Russian leaders this week, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's made it clear that his patience is running out.
Bunun için şayet Amerika ile 2 hafta içinde arzu ettiğimiz sonuca ulaşamazsak, kendi harekat planımızı uygulamaya başlayacağımızı her iki dostumuza da anlattım.
The message was clear, especially as the comments were made in the presence of two US adversaries. And it also echoed comments that Erdogan had previously made, criticizing US support for the YPG.
Bu terör örgütlerinin şu anda mücadele verdiği, savaştığı Türkiye'dir. Siz de bu getirdiklerinizi kime teslim ediyorsunuz? Bu terör örgütlerine teslim ediyorsunuz. Biz NATO'da sizin ortağınızız. Siz NATO'daki ortağınıza parayla vermediğiniz silahları bunlara bedava veriyorsunuz. Bunu anlamak mümkün değil.
This is Akçakale on the Turkish border with Syria, and it's where the US-Turkey Joint Operations Center is based. Now, along with the joint patrols in Syria, this is the first phase of the safe zone deal. But as for what comes next, well, that's shrouded in uncertainty. Erdogan has spoken about the safe zone potentially becoming a place to send back a large number of the Syrian refugees in Turkey. But the US has given no indication that it would back that proposal. And Washington still has issues with its NATO allies' flirtation with Moscow, especially when it comes to Turkey's purchase of the Russian S-400 missile defense system.
Eyeing any sanctions over Turkey's purchase of S-400s from Russia?
We're looking at that. I'm not going to make any comments on any specific decisions, but we are looking at it.
It seems that the American camp is divided over how to deal with Turkey, with President Donald Trump appearing not to want to sanction Ankara. But if Turkey's military were to unilaterally move into Syria, then Washington's hand may be forced. Abu Bakr al-Shamahi, Straight Talk, Akçakale on the Turkey-Syria border.
And joining our panel from Brussels is Catherine Woolard, who is the Secretary General of the European Council on Refugees and Exiles. Catherine, welcome to Straight Talk. We just mentioned that US and Turkey have agreed on a safe zone in the east of the Euphrates, for which President Erdogan said up to 2 or 3 million Syrian refugees can resettle in their countries. Will this be a realistic alternative to bring those people in and in a way to reintegrate them with their native country?
I think we have concerns about the idea of safe zones, which is something of a misnomer because many of these zones are not safe. Since the Astana talks, we've seen the so-called de-escalation zones be used for two problematic purposes. One is that they facilitate the land grab being carried out by the Syrian regime. The second is that they're used to justify premature return of Syrians to Syria, a country which is not safe for them. For us, the priority should be allowing Syrians to reach safety. The situation in Idlib is going to lead to a new wave of displacement, and those people need to be allowed to, for instance, cross into Turkey. But the responsibility has to be better shared because Turkey is doing so much already. So we want to see the rest of Europe preparing properly to also share responsibility for Syrian refugees.
Are they ready to step in?
I think what we've seen, unfortunately, the EU, through the EU-Turkey deal, has tried to buy its way out of this situation by offering certain benefits to Turkey, and in exchange, Turkey has then prevented the departure of Syrians to Europe, as we know. That strategy allows for political exploitation by Turkey, as we see now with the threats from President Erdogan, but also by Russia. We also see the risk currently, because of the very precarious situation in Idlib that your correspondents have described, that an additional displacement crisis will create political panic in Europe. In fact, the number of people on the move is something that Europe could handle if that was done collectively. So we would like to see better preparedness for the coming difficulties.
But the time is running out, at least for Idlib. Talib, what would you say about that?
I think Europe is not well prepared. We have seen that before. I think that is the case, especially given the rising populist parties and political climate in Europe. I think Europe will not step in, will not accept more, let's say, refugees or immigrants. Europe even does not help Turkey, which has been carrying the burden for the last 7-8 years on this issue. But there is a lot of risk that a new wave of migration might begin if there is no solution in Idlib, at least for the near future. In that case, of course, Turkey looks for different alternatives and different options. One option is, establishing a safe zone in the Syrian territory, where people can be, located, looked after, because Turkey has a lot of experience in that, establishing camps, also, building the infrastructure there. And of course, no single country can do this on its own. Therefore, Turkey needs international support and cooperation, and Europe can play an important role in that, along with, of course, Iran and Syria, Russia.
Yeah, tell us about Russia's position with regards to this safe zone.
Well, I mean, Russia is supportive of any kind of solution that could lead to ultimately a safeguarding sovereignty and territory of Syria that would, at the same time, include all sides in a constructive way, respectful of international law. Now, of course, the international community has to be brought in. Russia has to continue to play this kind of central mediating role. We have to remember that, one of the big reasons why Russia is in Syria is it wants to cement some kind of larger global international status. So anything that would sort of marginalize that would be opposed to. But there's also a very realistic appraisal of what Turkey's security situation is, and also a sense of, the difficulties on the ground. So these kind of options are open, though extremely difficult to implement. I mean, the success of, let's say, weeding out elements that are extremist that could, cause more conflict and trouble is not very good. And creating this kind of large swathe, safe zone, doesn't say much, or doesn't really speak much to the continued stability and security of Turkey itself.
I want to get back to Catherine. Catherine, President Erdogan has called for a stronger support from Europe, has given the member countries a kind of sense of urgency to step in and help.
I think there is a sense of urgency, not least because of the increasing number of arrivals of people in Greece.
Yeah.
The EU-Turkey deal was based on the idea that Turkey would prevent people from leaving, prevent departures from Turkey. And Erdogan, of course, is able to use his role and his leverage in order to extract concessions from the Europeans. This was always going to be a short-term strategy, because in the long term, remaining dependent on that is extremely risky.
But Catherine, President Erdogan says the promises made by the European Union haven't been delivered.
I think that certain of those promises have been delivered. The problem is we don't really know what all the promises are. The relationship between the EU and Turkey is one that is extremely opaque, and leverage on the European side lies in security cooperation, in investment, in measures that we can't really, that are often very untransparent. I think what we see with Erdogan's current stance is the risk to the Europeans of relying on this strategy instead of trying to sort out among themselves a system of collective responsibility for the refugees who are arriving. And when we're talking about the Syrian displaced population, we are talking about refugees, and we are talking about numbers that Europe could actually manage. So for instance, we're proposing the installation of a temporary protection regime within Europe, should there be an increasing number of Syrians coming. And I think many of the debates about safe zones, but also the threat of deportation, forced deportation back to Syria, also encouraging Syrians, the 3.6 million Syrians that are hosted within Turkey, to look at Europe again as their best option to reach safety.
Yeah.
So this is coming one way or another, and we after certain amount of lessons have been learnt since the damaging political crisis of 2015-2016.
So, Catherine, it might sound a bit controversial, but can we say that Europe's fear of refugees is the only thing that can save Syria?
Firstly, I don't think we should use the expression Europe's fear of refugees.
But it's a fact.
There wasn't. Well, there are as many people who work to support refugees within Europe, far greater numbers than those who are voting for extremist parties who don't want any refugees or other migrants arriving in Europe. And I think often we give too much weight to the positions and the opinions of those who are hostile. So the situation within Europe is not, if we look at populist parties, for instance, most of them are experiencing a decline or stability in their voting share. The European Parliament elections didn't lead to a huge wave of populists. The Parliament is actually more progressive than during the last mandate and is currently resisting anti-migration language and positioning from the European Commission. So we have to take a more nuanced approach to this. I think the risk occurs when the situation becomes one of panic, and that's why planning and preparedness in cooperation with Turkey as a major refugee hosting country needs to be done now, given the situation in Idlib that you've been discussing.
So, okay, thank you, Catherine. Talib, should we expect more negotiations with the European Union, especially on this issue? And do you believe that Turkey's warning on opening these doors to Europe could make some European countries at least put pressure on the US for the creation of the safe zone?
I think for the Turkish officials and for the Turkish people at large, Syrian refugees are not a matter of bargaining, okay? We are talking about a humanitarian issue here. We are talking about 3.6 million within Turkey, and also possibly maybe more who might come if the situation in Idlib gets worse. Therefore, Turkey would like to open a new chapter and also new avenues of, I think, both diplomatic, economic, and political negotiation on that front. Now, Catherine said something that, forced return of Syrians to Syria, back to Syria. There has not such a case. There hasn't been any case. So far, 350,000 Syrians went back to Syria, and they were all on a voluntary basis, and that happened after Turkey's 2 operations within the Syrian border. So now, when we look at the situation here, what are the options that we have? 1 million more coming to Turkey, and I think when you look at cities where almost 20-30% of the population is Syrian refugees, when you look at the education, health, infrastructure of the city, things are getting worse there.
Yes.
It is not difficult to sustain. Turkey is after sustainable solutions that requires international support and burden sharing.
Yes.
And one issue is also having a safe zone, but as I said, the safe zone must be supported by the international community.
Also, Andrei, Russia calls for support from the international community. But where does Russia stand when it comes to this humanitarian assistance?
Well, I mean, Russia has provided a humanitarian assistance, but it can't do so alone. I mean, this will take, a major effort by the entire international community to deal with this refugee crisis. So I think the last figure I saw from the UN was $250 billion in reconstruction aid. Russia can't afford that. No country could afford that, not even the United States. So we would need a pooled international effort, and that's exactly what Russia would like to bring. Not necessarily for any altruistic reasons, but again, to the theme, that I spoke to before, right? Russia comes out then out of this crisis looking like a major international player, and that one that can bring stability to this region and a solution to these kinds of crises that we've seen of, you know, fragmented states, failed states, ethnic, confessional strife. Russia has, you know, now a record of a kind of solution. At least that's what it wants to present to the rest of the world.
All right, I'm afraid we have to leave it here. Talip, Andrei, thank you for joining me on Straight Talk. And Catherine, thank you for joining us from Brussels. Appreciate it a lot. And that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Ayşe Süberker. If you've got any comments, do share them with us on Twitter with the hashtag Straight Talk. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time, take care and goodbye.